The sound of soft music filled the air as Emily stepped into the room, the scent of fresh flowers swirling around her. She could hear the excited murmurs of guests as they took their seats, the hum of quiet chatter blending with the occasional burst of laughter. But amidst all of that, one voice stood out, Jack's. And the moment she caught sight of him, everything else seemed to disappear. It wasn't just his familiar face she noticed, but the way his eyes locked onto hers as if he were seeing a ghost. It was as though the world had stopped turning for a brief moment. She couldn't help but wonder, does he still feel the same? The thought lingered in her mind, uninvited, yet impossible to shake off. But Emily quickly brushed it aside. She was here to support him, not to dredge up the past. She had moved on. At least that's what she kept telling herself. Emily had been invited to Jack's wedding, not as a friend, not as a former lover, but as a guest. It was a chance to see him get married to someone else, to close the chapter that had been left unfinished 3 years ago. She had walked in with her head held high, convinced that this moment was about closure. But nothing about this day was going to be as simple as she thought. The ceremony was about to begin when it happened. Jack, standing at the altar with his bride-to-be, froze. His eyes never left Emily's. He looked like he had just seen a ghost, and for a moment Emily could have sworn she saw a flicker of something deep in his gaze. A feeling that she couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Desire? Or something else entirely? The seconds stretched on, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. The tension was thick, suffocating almost. Jack's bride, confused and clearly uncomfortable, looked from Jack to Emily, unsure of what was happening. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. She had seen Jack in many moments, happy, sad, angry, but never like this. Never so vulnerable. And then, without warning, he broke the silence. "I can't do this," Jack said, his voice shaky. The words sent a ripple through the crowd, as if someone had just thrown a stone into a calm lake. The murmur of confusion spread quickly. But it was Emily's face Jack was focused on. Everyone else seemed to disappear. All that mattered was her. He turned to the priest, looking torn. "I'm sorry. I can't marry her. I can't marry anyone." The room fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. Emily stood frozen in place, unsure of how to respond. She had imagined so many different scenarios leading up to this day, but none of them involved this. None of them involved Jack stopping his own wedding in front of everyone, with her as the reason. Was this real? Was this happening? She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but all she could focus on was Jack, standing there with his eyes locked on hers, as if waiting for something, anything. A sign? A response? What did he want from her now? She had no idea. She couldn't even process what had just happened. The woman standing beside him, the woman who had been so excited just moments ago, looked lost. The guests were whispering, their voices overlapping in a tangled mess of confusion and shock. But all Emily could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She wanted to walk away, to run out of the church and leave this chaos behind, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move, and she couldn't understand why. The question echoed in her mind once more. Does he still feel the same? But the truth was she didn't know. She didn't even know what she felt anymore. Emily stood there, frozen in the midst of the chaotic silence that followed Jack's shocking confession. The eyes of the room were all on her, but she couldn't bring herself to move. It felt like she was trapped in a moment that didn't belong to her, as though the world was watching her make a decision she hadn't even begun to understand. The air was thick, and she could almost hear the whisper of the guests behind her, their voices too low to make out but clearly buzzing with curiosity and confusion. But in that instant it was just her and Jack. Everyone else disappeared. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. Jack, the man she had once loved more than anything, had just stopped his own wedding, in front of everyone. And the reason? Her. She hadn't even realized that she still had this power over him, or maybe she did but had never truly acknowledged it. Seeing the look in his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, shook her more than she wanted to admit. She had spent the last few years convincing herself that their relationship was a thing of the past, that it was over. And yet here he was, undoing everything she had worked so hard to put behind her. It was like nothing had changed, like they were back in the same place they were 3 years ago when they first met. But so much had changed. Emily had changed. And so had Jack. She couldn't deny the pull she felt, the old attraction that was still there, but she also couldn't ignore the reasons why they had separated in the first place. The hurt, the broken promises, the endless fights that had led them to this point. And yet, in that moment, all those feelings seemed to vanish, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar desire to understand what was happening. Jack looked at her, his face pale, his eyes searching hers for something, anything. Was it hope? Regret? Fear? Emily didn't know. She didn't know what he wanted from her, but whatever it was, she wasn't sure she could give it to him. She wasn't the same person who had fallen for him so easily all those years ago. Jack, stop, she finally said, her voice trembling slightly, but strong enough to break through the tension. His gaze didn't falter, it only deepened. You don't have to do this, Emily continued, her voice steady now, but her heart was racing. You've made your choice. This is your wedding. She's your future. Jack's face twisted with something like pain. I thought I was sure, Emily, he said softly. I thought I was ready. But when I saw you, everything just stopped. It was like I couldn't breathe. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that, to admit that seeing her had undone everything he thought he knew about his future. It wasn't fair. To her. To his bride. To everyone who had come here to celebrate this day. Jack, don't do this. Don't make this about us, Emily said, shaking her head. It's not fair to her. It's not fair to you. We don't belong together anymore. The words felt like they were choking her, but they were the truth. And somehow, even though it hurt, saying them out loud made the situation feel less impossible. Jack took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, but Emily stepped back, instinctively pulling away. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know how to let you go. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she wished things had been different, but she couldn't. She couldn't go back. She had spent too long rebuilding herself, finding a version of herself that was strong and independent, a version of herself that didn't need Jack to feel complete. She had to let him go. For both of their sakes. Jack, I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice breaking as she spoke the words that had been stuck in her throat for so long. But we can't go back. We're not the same people we were when we were together. I'm not the same person. She paused, trying to steady her breathing. You have to marry her. You owe it to yourself. And to her. Jack's shoulders sagged as he finally seemed to understand. His eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, they were filled with resignation. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, before turning away from her and walking back to his bride. Emily stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing in her chest, before she slowly turned and left the church, the echoes of the ceremony fading behind her. She had done the right thing. She had let him go. But it didn't make the pain any easier. Emily couldn't remember the last time she felt so confused. The cool air of the evening wrapped around her as she walked slowly down the church steps, her mind replaying the events of the day like a broken record. She could hear the distant sounds of the wedding guests starting to leave the church behind her, but it felt as though she were in a bubble, separated from everyone. She had done the right thing. She had told Jack what needed to be said. She had let him go. But even as she walked away, her chest ached with a kind of emptiness she hadn't expected. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was over him, that they were better off apart. She had built a life for herself, a new life where Jack didn't fit anymore. And yet here she was, standing on the edge of the very thing she had left behind. She couldn't deny the pull she still felt, the one that tugged at her heart every time she thought of him. But was it love? Or was it just the remnants of something old, something that was better left in the past? The cold air bit at her skin as she stepped into her car, the leather seats feeling unusually stiff as she sat down. She put the keys in the ignition but didn't start the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her fingers tapping nervously. She knew she had to go home. She knew she had to move forward. But she couldn't help but wonder what would happen now. Would Jack try to reach out to her? Would he keep pursuing her? She had no idea what the next chapter would bring. But deep down, Emily knew that whatever came next, it had to be on her terms. She couldn't let herself be pulled back into the past. She couldn't keep going in circles, questioning what might have been. She had to face the future. The car started with a soft hum, and she pulled out of the parking lot, the church fading into the background behind her. Her phone buzzed in her bag, and she instinctively reached for it, but then hesitated. Maybe it was Jack. Maybe he was reaching out. But then, a quiet voice inside her told her that it didn't matter. Not anymore. She put the phone down without checking it, focusing instead on the road ahead. It was going to be a long drive home. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of memories and emotions, but she kept her eyes on the road, refusing to let the past take hold of her again. As the miles passed, Emily started to feel a sense of clarity. She had made the right decision today, even if it didn't feel like it right now. She had been brave, and she had done what was best for both of them. Jack was still stuck in the past, but Emily had moved forward. She just had to remember that. When she finally arrived home, Emily didn't feel the relief she had hoped for. Instead, she felt a quiet emptiness. She had built a life for herself, a life without Jack, and now she was facing the consequences of what it meant to leave him behind. There was no turning back now. She had to find a way to move forward for good. The evening stretched on, and Emily sat in her living room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She had been strong today, but tomorrow she would have to be even stronger. For herself. For her future. She just hoped she could keep the courage to stay the course. Emily awoke the next morning to the soft light filtering through her bedroom window. The events of the day before were still fresh in her mind, like a movie she couldn't escape. She had tried to convince herself that everything would be okay, that moving on was the right choice, but the weight of Jack's confession kept pressing on her chest. She lay there for a few moments staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess. What now? She had faced the past, spoken the truth, and let go. She had done everything she could to close that chapter. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She got out of bed, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The house was quiet, the stillness comforting yet suffocating. She walked into the kitchen, the smell of coffee brewing filling the air. She had always loved the mornings, the quiet before everything else in the world woke up. But today it felt different. Today there was a hole, an emptiness where her confidence had been. She poured herself a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the garden, the early morning dew sparkling like tiny diamonds on the grass. She had once imagined sharing moments like this with Jack. But those days were gone. She had to accept that. Taking a sip of the coffee, Emily thought about her life now. It had been a few years since she and Jack had separated, but it felt like a lifetime. She had built a life for herself, one that didn't involve him, one that didn't need him. But deep down, she knew that part of her would always carry the mark of their relationship. It was inevitable. She had loved him. She had believed in him. And even now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't deny that a part of her wanted him to come back, to fight for her. But that wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to either of them. She had to stop pretending that they could just pick up where they left off. The past was over. And yet, it still clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. As the morning passed, Emily decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head, to breathe. The world outside seemed to have moved on while she had stayed stuck in that moment at the church. People were out walking their dogs, children were riding bikes, and the sun was shining as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She walked for a while, her feet carrying her through the streets of the neighborhood, the familiar sights providing little comfort. She passed the cafe where she and Jack had spent so many mornings, the place where they had talked for hours, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. The memories came flooding back, overwhelming her for a moment. She stopped in front of the cafe, her heart tightening in her chest. Could she ever truly move on from him? Could she ever really let go of the love they had shared? She didn't know the answer. But as she stood there, she realized something important. She didn't need to have all the answers right now. It was okay to not know. She didn't have to have everything figured out. What mattered was that she was trying. She was trying to move forward. And that was enough. With a deep breath, Emily turned away from the cafe and continued her walk, her heart still heavy but her steps a little more determined. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to find out. And for the first time in a long time she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The next few days felt like a blur for Emily. She tried to return to her usual routine, but the weight of the previous weekend hung over her like a cloud she couldn't escape. At work she went through the motions, smiling when needed, participating in meetings, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself thinking about Jack more often than she cared to admit, replaying the scene at the church over and over again. The way he had looked at her, the raw emotion in his eyes, it was impossible to ignore. But as much as she wanted to believe that there was still something between them, she couldn't let herself go back to him. She had made that choice. She had moved on. Or at least she had tried to. The evenings were the hardest. After a long day, she would come home to an empty house, the silence a constant reminder of the life she had left behind. She had filled her apartment with plants, artwork, and little trinkets to make it feel like a home, but at night, it still felt cold. She would curl up on the couch with a book, trying to distract herself from the thoughts swirling in her head, but the words on the page never seemed to stick. It was as if her mind kept wandering back to him, to their past, to what might have been. One evening, as she sat in the living room, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something in her gut told her it was Jack. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen, before finally answering. "Hello," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Emily." It was Jack's voice. She could hear the uncertainty in his tone, the hesitation, as though he wasn't sure if he should even be calling. "Hi, Jack," she replied softly, trying to steady her nerves. "I wasn't sure if I should call," he said, his voice laced with regret. I don't know what I was thinking the other day. I shouldn't have put you in that position." Emily closed her eyes, letting out a quiet sigh. She had known this was coming. She had known he would reach out, but hearing his voice again brought everything to the surface. She had to be strong. She had to stay firm in her decision. "Jack," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "you did what you felt was right in the moment. But I can't go back. I can't change what happened, and I can't pretend like we can just pick up where we left off." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Emily could feel the weight of his silence. "I know," he said finally. I don't know how to let go." Emily's heart tightened at his words. She had been there once, clinging to something that was no longer meant to be, and she knew how hard it was to let go. But she also knew that it was the only way forward. "You have to let go, Jack," she said gently. "For both of us. We can't keep holding on to the past." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It's time to move on." Another silence stretched between them, longer this time. Emily's grip on the phone tightened, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wasn't sure if it was for him or for herself, but it didn't matter. She had to do this. She had to let go. "I understand," Jack finally said, his voice soft but resigned. "I'll respect your decision." "Thank you," Emily whispered. "Take care of yourself, Jack." And with that she ended the call. She sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the phone in her hand. It was over. It was really over. And somehow it felt both like a weight had been lifted and like a part of her had been left behind. But as she wiped the tear from her cheek and stood up, Emily knew that she had made the right choice. She had let go. She had said goodbye. And now she could finally start living for herself again. Days passed, and Emily felt like she was slowly starting to find her rhythm again. The rawness of the phone call with Jack had faded, though the echoes of it still lingered in her mind. She had made her peace with it, or at least she thought she had. She returned to her normal routine, finding solace in the little things she had built for herself. Work was busy, which helped distract her from the occasional quiet moments when she allowed her mind to wander. At night, instead of lying awake thinking about what might have been, she filled her time with new hobbies: painting, reading, taking long walks through the park. She even started trying new recipes in the kitchen, something she had never done when she was with Jack. There was a sense of liberation in it, like she was discovering a side of herself she had never known. But even as she moved forward, there were moments of doubt. Late one evening, as she sat on the couch with a book in her hands, the soft sound of a knock on the door broke the quiet. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't like her to get unexpected visitors. She stood up slowly, the book falling from her lap as she walked to the door. When she opened it, she was met with the last person she expected to see. "Jack," He was standing there looking as lost as she had ever seen him. His eyes were searching hers, almost pleading. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's stomach tightened, her heart racing. She wasn't sure she was ready for this. She had moved on. She had let go. But seeing him there so vulnerable made her feel like she was back at square one. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "What are you doing here, Jack?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He walked in slowly, like he was treading carefully around something fragile. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything. About you. About us. And I realize now that I made a huge mistake." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard this before, or at least something similar. Jack had apologized so many times during their relationship, but those words had never felt real. Was this any different? "Jack, I don't think we can keep doing this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We've both changed. You're right that we had something special, but that doesn't mean we should go back. We've grown apart." Jack's face fell, and for a moment, Emily saw a flicker of the man she once knew, the one who had been so full of promise, so full of hope. But she also saw the man who had hurt her, the man who had made her question herself, her worth, and their future together. She couldn't let herself go back to that. "I'm not asking you to forget everything, Emily," Jack said. His voice strained. "I just need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did. For not being the man you deserved. I've spent so much time running from my mistakes, but I realize now that I can't move forward unless I make things right with you." Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had heard the apology, but the scars were still there. "I appreciate your apology, Jack. I really do. But I can't live in the past anymore. We both need to keep moving forward." There was a long silence between them, thick with unsaid words. Finally, Jack nodded, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that I still care. I'll always care about you, Emily." "I know," Emily replied softly, her voice barely a whisper. "And I'll always care about you too. But we have to let go. For both of our sakes." Jack stood there for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say more, but then he turned and walked toward the door. Emily followed him, her heart heavy with the weight of their conversation. She opened the door for him, and as he stepped out she whispered, "Goodbye, Jack." As the door closed behind him, Emily felt a sense of finality wash over her. She had said what needed to be said. She had let go once and for all. And in that moment, as she stood there alone, she realized that she was ready to move forward, truly move forward without looking back. Emily woke up to the soft glow of sunlight peeking through the curtains. It was a new day, and though her heart still felt heavy from the events of the past weeks, there was something different about the morning. She had made a decision, a final one, and now she had to live with it. She walked into the kitchen, the familiar smell of coffee already filling the room, but there was no comfort in it today. She had learned to navigate the quiet of her apartment after Jack's last visit, but this morning the silence felt louder. It was a new kind of quiet, one that wasn't filled with regret or unresolved feelings, but one that was full of potential. She had taken the steps to move on, to cut the ties that had bound her to the past, and now she had to figure out what came next. It was as if the world was asking her, "What do you want now?" And the answer wasn't easy to find. She had spent so much time focused on what she was leaving behind that she hadn't given herself the space to think about what she was moving toward. She grabbed her phone and opened the calendar, looking at the empty weekends ahead. A small smile tugged at her lips as she realized how long it had been since she had planned anything for herself. She had always been the type of person who lived for the future, always trying to plan and anticipate what was next, but now it felt like she could just be. Emily had spent so much of her life trying to build a future with someone else, a future that never came to be. Now it was time to build one for herself. With that thought in mind, she grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The weather was crisp, the kind of autumn day that invited long walks and time spent outdoors. She didn't have any particular destination in mind, but the idea of wandering, of allowing herself the freedom to go wherever her feet led her, felt like the right choice. As she walked through the park, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. She felt a sense of liberation. She passed families out for a stroll, runners jogging by, and people just enjoying the simple pleasure of being outside. She couldn't help but think about how different her life was now. She had always envisioned herself with someone, sharing these moments, building a life together. But now, as she walked alone, there was a strange sense of contentment. She didn't need anyone else to fill the spaces in her life. She was enough just as she was. The realization was freeing, but it also made her pause. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to truly process everything that had happened. The heartbreak, the mistakes, the lessons learned, they had all brought her to this moment. And this moment, standing in the middle of a park, feeling the autumn air on her skin, was hers. It was hers to enjoy, hers to cherish, and hers to define. She sat on a nearby bench, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Emily didn't need to figure everything out in that moment. She didn't need to have it all planned. She just needed to be present, to enjoy the space she had carved for herself. She had a whole life ahead of her, a life that was no longer defined by the past. It was a life she was going to create on her own terms. With that thought, she stood up, dusted off her jacket, and continued walking, her steps light and free. The future was still unknown, but it was hers to discover. And for the first time, Emily felt ready to embrace it. It had been a few weeks since Emily had started embracing her new life. She had settled into a routine that, while unfamiliar, felt right. She had let go of the past, and in doing so, she had created a space for herself to grow, to discover who she was without the weight of old expectations or relationships. The days were no longer filled with doubt, but with possibility. Emily spent her time working, yes, but she also carved out moments for herself. Time to explore new hobbies, meet new people, and even travel to places she had always wanted to visit. She had started going to art classes, something she had always wanted to do but never had the chance to. She had also started hiking on weekends, the wide open spaces giving her a sense of freedom she hadn't known she was missing. It was during one of these hikes that Emily had an unexpected encounter. She had just reached the top of a trail, the view before her breathtaking, when she noticed a figure sitting on a large rock nearby. It was a man around her age, with a kind face and an easy smile. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes met hers. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" he said, his voice warm and inviting. Emily smiled, nodding. "It's incredible. I'm glad I made the hike up." The man stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "I'm glad you did too," he said. "It's always nice to meet someone else who appreciates the outdoors." Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of ease in his presence. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people sharing the moment. They talked for a while about their favorite hiking spots, their travels, their lives. It wasn't the kind of conversation Emily had expected to have with a stranger, but somehow it felt natural. When it was time to leave, the man gave her a friendly wave. "It was nice talking to you, Emily. Maybe I'll see you around." Emily smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. As she continued her hike, her mind was clear. She had made a new connection, a simple, unassuming one, but it reminded her of something important. She wasn't alone. She had friends, and there were still opportunities for new ones. Life had a way of offering unexpected moments of joy, and Emily was learning to embrace them as they came. The next day, as she sat in her favorite cafe, sipping a coffee, Emily reflected on how far she had come. She had stepped into this new chapter of her life with uncertainty, but now she was finding peace in it. She was no longer holding on to the past, no longer waiting for something that had already passed. She was living for herself, and that was enough. The memories of Jack, while still present in her heart, no longer controlled her. She had learned to forgive, to let go, and to move on. It was a process, and there were still days when she felt the weight of the past, but she no longer let it define her. Emily was beginning to understand that her happiness was not dependent on anyone else. She didn't need someone to complete her, to give her a sense of purpose. She had found that purpose on her own. As the months passed, Emily continued to grow, both in her career and in her personal life. She was meeting new people, making new connections, and building a life that was uniquely hers. And while the future remained uncertain, she now felt ready for whatever it might bring. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days continued to move forward, each one bringing with it a subtle shift in Emily's mindset. She had learned to embrace the little moments, the quiet victories that came with living her life on her own terms. She had stopped waiting for closure, stopped looking for validation from the people and the past that no longer had a place in her world. For the first time in a long time, Emily truly felt free. One Saturday afternoon, she found herself walking through a bustling farmer's market, the vibrant colors of fresh produce and flowers surrounding her. The sun was bright, and the air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, two things that had become staples in her new routine. She wasn't sure what had brought her to the market that day, but as she walked past the stands, tasting samples and chatting with the vendors, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She was here for herself, doing something she enjoyed without thinking about anyone else. As she rounded a corner, Emily spotted a familiar face. It was the man she had met during her hike, the one who had seemed so easy to talk to. He was standing by a stall selling handmade candles, smiling at something the vendor was saying. When he noticed Emily, his face lit up. "Hey Emily, fancy seeing you here," he said, his voice warm and friendly. She smiled back, surprised but pleased. "I didn't expect to run into you," she replied, taking a step closer. "It's a small world," he said with a chuckle. They exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed since their hike. Emily didn't know what she was expecting from this encounter, but it felt natural, easy. She realized that she had stopped questioning every interaction, stopped searching for hidden meanings or future implications. She was simply enjoying the moment, and that was enough. "I'm actually picking up some candles as a gift for a friend," he said. "They're amazing, aren't they?" Emily nodded. "They really are. I might have to grab one myself." They both laughed, and it felt like two old friends catching up, though they had only met a few weeks ago. After a few more minutes of conversation, the man smiled and said, "It was great seeing you again, Emily. Hopefully, we'll run into each other again soon." Emily smiled in return, feeling no pressure, no expectations. "Take care," she said as he walked off toward another stand. As she continued to wander the market, Emily felt lighter than she had in a long time. She had made progress not just in moving on from the past but in learning how to live in the present. She had come to realize that there was no rush to find something or someone to complete her. She was already whole, and everything else was just an added bonus. The weeks that followed were a blur of new experiences, new connections, and continued growth. Emily spent time with friends, reconnected with family, and even took a weekend trip to the coast, something she had always dreamed of doing. There was no longer a void to fill, no longing for something she didn't have. She was content with where she was and who she was becoming. And then one evening, as she was watching the sunset from her apartment window, she felt it. A sense of peace, a quiet understanding that she had truly moved on. The past was no longer a weight she carried. She had forgiven herself for the mistakes she had made. And she had forgiven Jack, even if she would never fully understand his choices. She was ready for whatever came next, not because she needed anything, but because she knew she was capable of handling it. Emily wasn't waiting for life to happen anymore. She was making it happen. She was finally living for herself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. The future was uncertain, but Emily no longer feared it. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she was strong enough to handle it. She had found herself, and that was all she needed.